Hello and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for joining today's webinar on applying design thinking to technology selection. My name is Scott Dill, and I'm on the sales team here at Real Story Group, and our managing director, Jarrod Gingras, will be joining us on the line momentarily to take us through the heart of today's presentation. But as we get started, I did want to mention a couple of quick housekeeping items of note. First and foremost, we should have some time for questions at the end, and even if we don't, we can still get back to you on those. So if you have any questions, just enter those into the tab on the GoToWebinar control panel. And also, you will be, as an attendee for today's presentation, you will be able to access the slides within the next couple of days. We'll be able to get those to you from our marketing team. So keep an eye out in your email for those. And then for our subscribers on the line, you'll be able to take a look at a recorded version of today's presentation in your subscriber library again later this week. So again, thanks to all for taking some time out of your day to join us. I did want to mention a couple quick things about Real Story Group here as we get started. First and foremost, we are an analyst firm in that we do things a little bit differently than other analyst firms. We don't advise vendors in any way, but rather we help you with the selection of the vendor that's going to be the right fit for what it is you're trying to do. So you see here listed are our 3 subscription offerings, which first and foremost, you can select one or multiple marketplaces that we cover, such as, say, digital asset management or customer data platforms. Get the research on the vendors in those spaces, as well as tools for creating a custom shortlist and comparing the vendors side by side, and getting some advice from our analysts, such as Jarrod, to get you down to the right vendor that's going to meet your goals. Number 2 is a little more of a newer offering from us, but it's something that's we've been consulting on for a while. It turned it more into a subscription offering, which is our omni-channel stack advisory. And with that, you have access to all of our omni-channel technology research, as well as 20 hours with our analysts team to really take you through and get an idea of where you're at with your MarTech or your omni-channel stack right now. What are some gaps, and what are some potential ways to alleviate those gaps? So certainly that's something to take a look at if you're responsible for your omni-channel stack internally. And finally, as an add-on to that package is our executive council, where we'll actually meet 2 to 3 times a year in a vendor-free environment to really learn from each other. So meeting with thought leaders in the space and learning from your peers so you can get an idea of what's happening out there with other tech stack owners, and what are some potential takeaways you can bring back to your organization to improve what you have going on from an omni-channel technology stack perspective. So if you ever need any information about that, certainly reach out to us. We're happy to provide you with some further information. Again, as I mentioned at the top, we're different than traditional analyst firms. So, excuse me, we don't consult the vendors in any way. We don't speak at their conferences or write white papers for them. If you take a look at an excerpt from our research, you'll notice that we really take a pull no punches approach in detailing what the vendors do well, but perhaps more importantly, where they might fall short for you. And we're the only analyst firm that we've come across in this space that has taken this type of approach. So certainly we're unique when it comes to the way that we work with the vendors, or in this case, don't work with the vendors that we cover within our research. Here's a snapshot of our coverage areas, and you can download a copy of this map right from our website, but you'll see the different color-coded areas. Areas such as web content management is the blue line, and the purple line of digital asset management. So these are the different markets that we cover within our research, and as you'll see, there are some hubs there in the middle, vendors such as Adobe, IBM, Salesforce, etc. But then there's what we consider to be the best in breed solution on the periphery of the map, and you're welcome to download excerpts from the research from any or all of these different markets that we cover. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jarrod. And again, please feel free to enter in questions as you have them throughout today's presentation. Jarrod?
Great. Thanks, Scott. And thank you all for taking a few minutes out of your busy schedules to join us on today's webinar, which is one that we're very passionate about, and that's this notion of applying design thinking to the technology selection process. And as Scott mentioned, one of our core remits as an analyst firm is to provide people information and advice in making the right possible decision when it comes to technology in your organization. And we've been doing that for the last 18 plus years. About 2 years ago, my colleague Tony and I wrote this book called The Right Way to Select Technology, which really documented this methodology that I'm going to walk you through today that we think is a little bit different than the traditional way of selecting technology. And quite frankly, we think it's a much better way of selecting technology, and I'll explain why. So first, before we get into this methodology about applying design thinking, I think many of you on the webinar today have probably seen some stats around the success and failure rates of technology projects. And there's some people out there who say 60% of these projects fail, some others say 40%, but I think it's pretty safe to say about half of all technology projects are deemed failures. And why is that? Now, there can be a variety of different reasons for that. I'm sure many of you have been through these types of projects before. A lot can go wrong during implementation. A lot can go wrong during your rollout with regards to change management and user adoption. But nothing pains me more seeing a project doomed to fail from the outset because an organization fundamentally chose the wrong technology for the job. Now that's a tough one, and so our mission as consultants and analysts in this space, who spend our lives helping companies make the right decision, we want to say, how can we solve this tough problem? How can we help improve the success rates around technology projects? And what we turn to is a terminology called design thinking, which is certainly not a new terminology, and I'll talk about that in a second. But Stanford's D School really put a lot of work into defining what design thinking truly is, and what it boils down to at its root is just a process and a way of thinking about tough to solve problems. And going back to that, why do 50% of technology projects fail? That's the tough problem that we were aiming to solve. And so we said, can we leverage some of the lessons of design thinking to solve that, to solve the way people actually procure and select technology for their organizations? And I mentioned, design thinking isn't a new term. It's been around for quite some time, but I think with the advent of the web and consumer-facing web in particular world, design thinking really exploded in the early 2000s. This hits very close home to me. I got my start in web development as a user experience advocate and building websites in the early 2000s. Design thinking was always top of mind for what we would apply to building user interfaces on the web. And but people have really in recent years taken that design thinking moniker and really tried to apply it to other tough problems as well, not just the web. But if we break down the definition a little more, again, Stanford says, design thinking is really about a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for business success. Now, again, you read a definition like this and you say, this is a no-brainer to apply to the technology selection process, because that's what you're trying to do. When you bring in new technology, you're trying to meet people's needs. You're trying to get the most out of the possibilities of the technology that you're bringing in, but ultimately you're trying to satisfy your requirements for business success. So here's a visual representation of how people tend to think about design thinking. It's a 5-phased approach, if you will, from an empathy phase, a definition phase, an ideation phase, a prototyping phase, and a testing phase. And so what we did is we took each of these steps and said, what if we could apply those steps to the process of evaluating technology options and assessing whether or not it's a good fit for your organization. And again, when you look at different firms out there, like this one's from the Nielsen Norman Group, who's very much in the design world for the web, they start to talk about things like using a shared language and a shared vocabulary to get buy-in amongst your team. It encourages innovation by exploring multiple avenues for solving the same problem. And this began to resonate with us because when we think back to the most successful technology selection projects that we've ever seen, it's those situations where people really were on the same page, really all speaking the same language. It's the projects that allowed the team to really consider multiple ways of solving the same problem. And that really resonated to us and said, I think we're onto something here. And, design thinking can and maybe should be applied to tech selection. So here's what we did. We took our traditional selection model and started to apply the various design thinking phases to this winnowing down process that every organization goes through. When you look at technology, you look at all the multitude of options that you have at your disposal, and hopefully you get down to a shorter list and you put them through their paces and ultimately come down to a winner. And what we found is it really does align quite nicely to the design thinking phases. Let's get into each one. So first phase is the empathy phase. Now, in order to truly empathize with your users, your business stakeholders, the people who will ultimately be living with any new technology system that you procure, what I find is kind of the biggest mistake that organizations truly make is they try to go out and speak to the different stakeholders and get them to boil down their needs into really granular requirements. And they take all those requirements and put them into a big long spreadsheet. And what I found is that it makes it really difficult to get everyone on the same page, because typically what happens in that situation is, stakeholder A gives their 10 lines of requirements, stakeholder B gives their 10 lines of requirements, and at the end of the day, you have a huge, massive spreadsheet of a bunch of requirements, but no one really knows what the full big picture is. No one really knows ultimately what you're trying to bring into this organization. They just care about their 10 lines, and hopefully that meets their needs. So instead, I want you to take your first step in this process to really put on paper a future-looking way of working with this new technology you're envisioning. So the way to do that is to create these narrative scenarios that describe the future experience. So instead of just give me a laundry list of features, really describe the way you want to work in the future. And we always say there's a bit of art and science to this, because you want to be descriptive without being overly prescriptive. So you don't want to tell the vendor exactly how you want it to be solved. You want to describe the future way you want to work and allow the vendors to say, hey, this is how our product best suits your needs. And what happens there is hopefully you get multiple different avenues for solving the same problem, so that you as potential buyers can say, this avenue from vendor XYZ is a better fit for us than what we might get from another vendor. So again, using those laundry list of requirements is really the first way that some of these projects go off the rails. I don't want you to start the project and take all those requirements in that spreadsheet and use that as the main bulk of your RFP process, the way you communicate to the vendors what you need. There's plenty of time for requirements gathering in a software project, and I know that we can get to that later, but as a first step in this process, focus on those narrative scenarios and make that the bulk of your way that you go to market and communicate to vendors what you potentially need. So here's an example of one of these narrative use cases. This is a digital asset management one, but and we don't need to read through every single word here, but the idea here is you want to make this as realistic as possible. So the way to do that is to describe, again, real actors or roles within your organization, real environments that people work within, real processes, real content types, and really, again, you're painting a picture of how you might potentially work in the future, but leave it open-ended enough for a vendor to be able to understand, okay, I understand what this organization is looking for. Here's how my software solution meets that need. And what you find here is not only are you communicating to vendors in a much more meaningful way. You know, vendors tell us all the time that they love getting a scenario-based RFP as opposed to a requirements-based RFP, because it just is a much richer description of what it is they're trying to do, and they can kind of assess if they think they're a good fit as opposed to guessing that they might be a good fit. But it also goes a long way in, you know, getting back to that design thinking notion of getting everyone speaking the same vocabulary, getting everyone on the same page. These scenarios can really align your own internal team so that everyone's marching in the same direction. Everyone truly understands what it is we're trying to buy here. So next, once we have our stories written, the next phase is the definition phase. And here is where I want you to really make sure that you get the right shortlist defined so that you are not wasting your time comparing apples and dump trucks, as I sometimes like to say. I want you to be able to go out there and find the right vendors to be putting through their paces as part of the rest of this process. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the big mistakes that we see is people going out and trying to document every single requirement in an organization. Another huge mistake is looking at single snapshot views of marketplaces from, I'll call them other analyst vendors, and saying who should be on my short list. And so many organizations start by saying, I'm only going to look at the upper right-hand quadrant of a single snapshot view of a marketplace. And I'm here to tell you that's just the wrong way to do this. Do not make this the way you go about getting a short list. This is such a narrow view of your options, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen a great fit come out of these other three quadrants for different organizations. So instead of doing that, what we advise our clients to do is to take an approach where you get not a single snapshot view of the marketplace, but a customized view for your needs. And you know, our subscribers use this tool that we have called the Real Quadrant Shortlist Generator. And here the premise is you identify which use cases are most important to you, and we ask you to give those use cases some weightings as to which ones are more important than others. And from those identified use cases and their weightings, we then match them up with the vendors that were fundamentally built to solve those particular use cases that you told us are most important, right? And that should be the way that you build your shortlist. Find the vendors that were built to solve your key use cases, and your time spent evaluating them is going to be so much more useful than looking at a single snapshot view. So this is where you need to do your homework, but as far as defining what you're going to be doing in the rest of this process, this is a critical step in making sure you make the right decision. Next is the ideation phase. And this is maybe the most critical stage in the testing process that we're going to talk about here on out. And here, what we're suggesting is that you do some head-to-head vendor demonstrations. Now, I'm sure everyone on this webinar today has seen some vendor demonstrations, whether it's in your own offices or at a conference or on a vendor webinar such as this, where a vendor gives you that slick demonstration that they give to everyone else that always works really well, that really highlights their latest and greatest innovations and features and functionality. And that can be helpful for some background information, but where this ideation phase can really be turned and twisted in your favor is if you get them to conduct much more realistic vendor demonstrations that resonate with your stakeholders, that truly meet your needs. So what I'm suggesting here is don't let them come in and give that same canned demonstration they give to everyone else. Have them actually come in and demonstrate your unique scenarios. Make them as real as possible so they're actually relevant to that stakeholder team that you have in the room. So it's not just this boring set of canned demos. Make it so that your stakeholders can see themselves using this new technology and so that they can see how it's going to improve the way they work. So just some key takeaways here. Scenarios are at the core of everything. You want them to demonstrate your unique scenarios, but also you want them to demonstrate the same scenarios in the same order if you can help it. So when we're working with our clients here, we tightly script these demonstration meetings and say, you're going to demonstrate scenarios 1 through 7 in this order, and you have this much time to do it. I don't want you to come in and give us PowerPoint. I want you to actually show how your product's going to solve these 6 scenarios or 7 scenarios. And then you're able to, what happens is your evaluation team who's sitting in on these demos can really compare apples to apples and apples throughout the week. And what I found is this is just so much better use of time for the people who have committed to participating in this process. And as you all know, doing a demo week is a lot of work, and it's a lot of resources and resource and time and it's kind of a big ask to ask of your stakeholder team. So you want to make the most of that time that you can. So make sure your entire team is represented. Make sure everyone attends the same demos every day. Ask the tough questions, especially around pricing. That I sit in on these quite a bit for our clients. My role there is to ask some of the tough questions, especially around pricing and what they're proposing versus what they're showing on the screen. But again, really hold them to demoing your scenarios so that you're able to truly understand what it's going to be like to work within the system and truly be able to assess how vendor A, B, and C stack up against each other. Next is the prototype phase. So ideally, out of that ideation demo week phase, you're able to down select from a short list of demoing vendors to a final 2. And once you come out of that week with your final 2, we always recommend that you do something that we call a competitive proof of concept, or some people call it a bake-off. And what we're really talking about there is taking this testing to the next level. So now we're not asking you to just show us how a vendor could meet our scenario needs. I want you to construct a situation where a vendor leads you through what I like to call more of a mini implementation, right? So you go back to your use case scenarios and say to the vendors in a head-to-head manner, say, I want you to lead us through how you would go about implementing a subset of these use case scenarios. So this is often the time you inject some more real content into the process, and maybe give them some sample assets to work with. It's also the time that you get maybe some real environments involved. Now, in today's SaaS world, the environment can be not as much of an issue, and that's good news because you can often spin up these test environments relatively quickly. But when it comes to environments, maybe you want to mimic the way people work. You might have some people working on desktops. You might want to have some people working on phones. Maybe you want to have some people working on tablets. However people truly work in your organizations, you want to mimic that as much as possible. So again, this is all about keeping it real and making it as real and relevant to those people that will be using the system. But the key part here is that not only are you learning a lot about what it's like to use the system, and this is your first chance for your users to actually get their hands on this technology and actually go through some workflows and enter content or publish content, depending on the type of technology. But you're learning a lot about what it's like to work with this vendor as well. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, that relationship can make or break a technology project as well. So you're learning so much about the technology, but don't divorce the people side of it, because that's really critical as well. Now, people always say, well, a competitive bake-off, and we usually recommend something a minimum of 2 weeks, but oftentimes these things can be 3 or 4 or 5, 6 weeks, and depending on the type of technology you're procuring, it could be 6 months to a year, in some of the most complex technology out there. And people say, well, that's going to be too many resources, and that's going to cost way too much for us to be able to do something like that. And I get that. I trust me, I understand the realities of having people stop their real jobs to do a bake-off such as this. But I can honestly say the organizations that do take the time to at least do a 2-week assessment, a true proof of concept, those organizations are the ones that almost to an organization the most successful in their selection process, because they did their due diligence at the end there to really make sure that they had a good fit. Now, there's always ways around this too. People ask all the time, what if I don't have the time and resources to spend doing these competitive proof of concepts? I would say that's okay. If you choose not to do a competitive proof of concept, please at least do a true proof of concept with your leader, because again, you'll learn so much about what it's like to work with that technology and the people before you sign on a full-blown contract. I think there's so much value in that I recommend that to everyone. And finally, what we've done here is we've really tried to suggest an approach to selecting technology that's based in testing, and it's one where you're giving up a little bit of perfection at the outset. You're not trying to capture every single requirement across the organization at the beginning, but you're trying to sketch something a little bit more imperfect. But what that allows you to do is kind of refine as you go along, because what we find as part of these projects, a lot of the selection teams out there don't know what you don't know, and you learn a lot through this process about what is even possible from the technology that you're looking at. And so needs change throughout these processes. When you start seeing these demos and seeing how different organizations attack the problem that you've laid out, I hear it all the time where people say, oh, we never even thought about doing it like that. And that can be good, and you can kind of change tack and go to, opposed to having that rigid set of requirements that kind of box you in some cases. And so what we're saying here is get to that right shortlist as quick as you can, and then test at every step of the way, and keep honing in and refining over time, so that you're all moving in the right direction, so that ultimately you're making the right technology and partner decision, and then the vendor is really certain that they're signing up with the right partner as well, and that's important too, that both feel like they're marching in the same direction. And again, we at Real Story Group, we do a lot about we talk a lot about doing analysis about the technology itself and evaluating how good of a fit things are from a technology perspective. But it's not just technology. It's overall scenario fit. Sure, technology fit in your stack is important, but don't divorce the partner from it, and don't divorce the value. The value, making sure that it's a good fit from a cost perspective, is always important as well. So the Nielsen Norman Group also, when they talk about design thinking, they say there's 3 significant components of common ground within teams: a shared vocabulary, tangible artifacts, and a trust-based team culture. And what we think is, when we apply that design thinking to this technology process, you get all three of these things if you do it right. That shared vocabulary in those use case scenarios, those tangible artifacts in the actual proofs of concepts that you develop, and a trust-based team culture because you've gotten a holistic input from all over your organization and everyone marching in the same direction and bought into where you're going. And so if you do this right, this process is a bit more iterative, a little bit less front-loaded in that requirements gathering, but we found it works really nicely with the modern approach to technology implementation, where you're likely doing some faster releases as opposed to big bang releases, and doing a proof of concept with a true bake-off. That work is not wasted. It can usually roll right into an implementation project. One last thing from Jacob Nielsen from the Nielsen-Norman Group. He often says a wonderful interface solving the wrong problem will fail. And we here at Real Story Group like to say a wonderful technology solving the wrong problem will also fail. So it's incumbent on all of us to find the right problem to solve the problems that are the right solution to solve the problems that you're all facing. So let's wrap up there. If anyone wants to sample the research, feel free to download a sample on there from any of the technology areas that Scott described. If anyone's interested in the book, it's available on Rosenfeld Media or on Amazon. Feel free to check us out there. I got one question that I'll quickly answer. I know we're running a bit short on time, and a question from Jeremy. What's the difference between a prototype and a POC? So when we talk about prototyping in our process, what we're talking about there is that there's really two phases of testing, right? So there's the demo phase and then there's the proof of concept phase, and they're similar, but the demo phase is where you're going to be evaluating probably 3 to 4 who are going to come in and give their demonstration. We're using the term prototype a little bit loosely there, but really what we were asking them to do is to, again, jump through some hoops a little bit, to not give that same canned demo or the same canned PowerPoint, but actually prototype something within their system that speaks to the needs that you laid out in your scenario. So that during that demo phase, you're getting those prototypes. The proof of concept is where we're taking it one step further, where you're not only getting to work with that prototype, but you're actually going to mimic a real implementation project as much as possible. And so you get to interact with not only the technology, but also the project management teams, the user experience teams, the business analysts, the salespeople, and really you get a holistic view of what it's like to work with that company. So thank you, Jeremy, for that question. All right, we're about out of time. Thank you all so much for joining us. As again, as Scott mentioned, we'll send you copies of the slides. If anyone has any questions or wants to connect on LinkedIn or Twitter to me directly or any of us at Real Story Group at any time. Thank you all so much for your time today. Have a great rest of your day.